Thank you very much for joining me today. Um, my name is Nicholas Longton. I'm the senior strategist at a company called ArcStone. Feel free to introduce yourself if you wish in the chat. This can be very interactive. Feel free to put in questions at any point. So I have been building websites since about 1996. Actually, before some of the accessibility laws we're going to talk about were even in effect. So a long time ago. My main focus for about the last 15 years has been on content and storytelling and strategy. Strategy is mostly to help nonprofits. So the outline for this today is going to be, we're going to talk about, the major parts. What is accessibility? We're going to get clarity around exactly what we mean when we say that. We're going to talk about why it really matters, especially to nonprofits, why you should care about it. I'm going to go through some of the fundamentals too, just to show you accessibility fundamentals, all the different components, because it's quite complicated. And then I'm going to show you some evaluation and maintenance strategies for evaluating your online presence for accessibility, how to maintain that. And I'm going to do some live demos if people want that. And if you are brave enough to put your website in the chat, I can look at your website live here and we can just take a peek with one of our accessibility tools and kind of see what it looks like. I can just do like a random nonprofit too as well if nobody wants to volunteer. Thank you for the polls. It looks like 50% of you have an accessibility statement and about 50% don't. So that's about average what I'm seeing. It's kind of about half of my clients now have some kind of statement. So don't forget, keep an eye on the ArcStone website in the events area. I think there's maybe over 16 on-demand webinars now, and there is a webinar already on demand for accessibility. That was a little different. That was really focused on your website. And I had one of my other accessibility people that I work with a lot on that one too. So if you want to see a couple different viewpoints, you can check that out. In this one, I'm expanding this to all your online presence. We're going to talk about social media and some other things and cover kind of your whole presence online and accessibility. So, and there's new webinars every month this year, at least one new one. So keep an eye on the events area. In case you have no idea who ArcStone is, ArcStone is a full service digital agency. We're based in Minneapolis. We have been around since 1997. And we do the full spectrum of creating websites and content and videos and even virtual events. And we do WordPress website hosting and kind of the full range of things. And we really do have sort of a specialty in accessible web design and accessible programming, because there's a lot of components to accessibility, both sort of design and programming. And because of the clients we work with, we started working and doing a lot of accessibility stuff, a while ago, 6 to 8 years ago, kind of before it was on most people's radar. And just some clients to give you an idea of some of the types of clients we work with. National Mentoring Resource Center, we did their website and helped them out with marketing. Phenomenal national nonprofit. Children in Nature Network kind of has a worldwide footprint. It's a phenomenal nonprofit, and their website, which we did, I think it won an award recently. It's super cool. If you want to see a really interesting, cool, highly branded and stylized site, check that out. Hunger Solutions, a local nonprofit helping with food scarcity. We built their website and helped them with ongoing kind of accessibility and SEO and marketing stuff. So some of our typical clients. I'm going to go into now kind of a discussion on why accessibility, a little bit of a story here, why we got so heavily involved with accessibility and why you should take this very seriously too. So this was a while ago. We had a client who gets a substantial amount of funding from the federal government, and they're do a lot of food aid work, food aid across the whole world, delivering food aid, and they get substantial amount of funds from the federal government. So we had kind of done a website for them with their existing brand, and it was fine and everything was great. And they happened to actually get a letter from the government. They got a letter that said you were kind of randomly selected as an audit to be audited for accessibility, and we found these issues. And they got this letter, and they were quite, of course, concerned. They cannot afford to lose that funding. And it was fine because we were able to look at those issues, and they weren't major. We corrected it for very little cost, and they're fine. And they, passed the next audit, and everything's fine. But it really that was about 6-8 years ago, something that got us really thinking, people aren't thinking about this. And this is going to become a bigger and bigger thing in the future. We need to really sharpen our accessibility skills and focus on this. So that's kind of how we started to really expand our knowledge base on accessibility. And when we were out looking for things, there were really poor resources available. There wasn't a lot of good information on accessibility. We looked at other agencies and no one was really addressing this back then. And still they're not. Still, most agencies and designers, it's not something that's really become commonplace yet. And this should be super important, I think, for the nonprofit industry, for every industry, but especially nonprofits where you really deal with usually helping people and helping underserved people. And your missions usually have something to do with inclusion and equity. And when we're talking about online accessibility, we're really talking about making the web an inclusive place for everyone of all abilities. And I'm actually seeing this now be asked about more frequently. I'm seeing very large donors and participants, employees, volunteers, people are trying to hire people or attract donors, and people are asking about accessibility. They're saying, what is your online accessibility? How are you making sure your online services and information is equitable and inclusive? So this is going to be a big thing, I think, for nonprofits going forward. It already is, and it's getting more and more as I show you some news articles and we start talking about laws. This is becoming, a very big issue. So let's get into just quick, what is accessibility? So we are all on the same page here, and just a tiny bit of history. You can go read more if you want. But there's basically an act, which was called the Rehabilitation Act. And they added something called Section 508 to the Rehabilitation Act. And then it was updated again in 1998. And that act was all about making sure people with different abilities have access to things. And what they started to look at in the 80s and 90s was technology. They said, of course, buildings have to have ramps and we have to have these different things. And, movie theaters, you have to have things for the hearing impaired. But technology also is becoming such a big part of people's lives. Technology has to be accessible. So you can go to section508.gov if you want to learn more. And don't worry about during this webinar taking notes or anything, because the follow-up email will contain every link and tool we talk about in this. And also this will be available on demand for you to watch as much as you want. So don't worry about, writing all these addresses down, but section508.gov kind of spells out the technology part of this. And ADA is the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is a little bit different. That more focuses on products and services and physical locations. But Section 508 really deals with technology, and it's kind of expanded. And as the internet has become a really big thing, the federal government and the current case law basically supports the concept that the entire internet is what's called a space of public accommodation, right? Like a public library has to have a wheelchair ramp or an elevator. The internet, because that's a space of public accommodation, the entire internet now has really fallen under that umbrella. We'll talk about that more, about what a space of public accommodation is. So in accessibility for your online properties, there's really three major core components that we'll touch on. The core components are functions. How does your online website and your social media, or if you have an app or anything else, how does it function? Can the functions be used by people with disabilities? Can they submit forms? Can they search if you have a search on your site? What are the functional things? And then design. How is the design look? Does it meet minimum requirements like font sizes, colors, contrast? Does your design meet the minimum requirements laid out in accessibility guidelines? And then content. Can your content be consumed by everyone? Can everyone see your photo gallery and understand what it is, even if they have no vision or poor vision? Can your videos be understood by someone with no hearing? Is it closed caption? So can your content be consumed by people with different abilities? So those are the three major areas we're going to be touching on: function, design, and content. And many people, unless you've worked with somebody with a disability or you've really looked into this, you probably haven't maybe seen in action how this actually works, how people who don't have perfect vision and hearing or motor function or cognitive function, or maybe they don't use a mouse and they have different devices. Many people don't understand how that works, but there's basically kind of three major areas that people with different abilities can leverage if they have some type of disability. So there's specific devices. There's actually keyboards that have Braille built in and different things like that. And then a lot of modern devices actually have accessibility baked in. For instance, the iPhone, which we'll touch on later, is an extremely popular device for people to use to access content and websites. And it has a lot of good accessibility features built in. Google too, and they just updated, there's a Google Talkback, which is another really cool thing on sort of the Android platform for phones. And then there is specialized software. Sometimes people use a computer or a phone, and there's special accessibility software they will use to help them navigate the internet and use websites. So what we're talking about when we talk about making sure your online properties really work well and are quote unquote accessible, it really, a big part of that is compatibility with these different devices that you may not have seen or used, and different software and stuff. And I'll talk a little bit later about how you can do some of your own experimenting and testing without having to own these devices. So as far as the technology that powers your website and stuff, there is coding and best practices that these software programs and devices are expecting. And if you don't have that in place, then they won't work usually. So that's kind of a little bit about the hardware and software. So reasons why you should really care about accessibility, a few more is, of course, you want to reach the widest audience possible, right? You don't want to exclude anyone from your online information. You want to be inclusive. So there is a huge audience out there that has different abilities, and I'm not sure that's commonly known. In the US alone, there are 10 million visually impaired people just in the US. And worldwide, there are hundreds of millions of people with various disabilities that impact how they use the internet. So, the audience is a big part of it. Also, like I talked a little bit about your funding. So you may not even realize you may have funding, and you may know the funding's contingent on some accessibility things. You may not. It's kind of more of a less a fine print thing. But nowadays we're seeing that more and more. We're seeing grants, government programs, different funding, all of it in the fine print has something about accessibility. If you're getting a grant to build a new part of your website, they're going to say it has to be accessible. Also, there's legal exposure, and it's not just big companies who are getting in trouble for accessibility, but really anyone who's trying to use your website. If they run into accessibility issues, you could very well get a demand letter and have to do something about it. So it's better to be ahead of these things and not have those issues to begin with. And of course, it's just the right thing to do, right? And as nonprofits caring and serving about people, you want to be inclusive. So these are really the big reasons. I'm going to switch this poll here I have a whole bunch of polls. Thank you for answering those. It's really nice to guide sort of this conversation, so you get the most out of this webinar. And there's another thing about accessibility, which I'm not sure is super common knowledge, but there's a lot of benefits to a highly accessible website. A highly accessible website that follows all the best practices and standards actually tends to be highly usable too. Highly usable by people with just average abilities. Who may not have any special considerations. That's how it usually happens. And there's lots and lots of people who don't see that well, right? Who they may have very poor computer screens combined with poor vision, or, they may not be into that area where you would consider them disabled, but they just don't have the best vision. Especially when you're talking about donor populations, a lot of nonprofits have some older donors, big donors giving a lot of money. They may be older, and, it's not going to be good if they have a really hard time understanding and seeing the information you're putting out there on your website. Also, it helps mobile functionality a lot. And I think we all know now mobile is a big deal, right? Google cares about it. It impacts your SEO. And as we talk about some of the little nitty gritty things, maybe I'll show you how actually accessibility and SEO just goes like hand in hand. It's a very much a hand in hand thing. Almost every single thing you'll do on your site to ensure it's highly accessible is going to actually help with your SEO. So it's kind of a win-win there. Thank you for answering the poll. It looks like some of you have tried an accessibility device, at least one of you. So that's cool. And like I said, with phones, you can always experiment with your phone. You can turn on those accessibility features, close your eyes, try to use your website. So let's talk about the fundamentals now. And I'm going to leave dedicated time in the end for Q&A too, but keep in mind, ask questions at any point. If I get to a part and something doesn't make sense or I didn't explain something, please feel free to ask any questions you want. So we talked about some of the core components. So for the fundamentals area, I'm going to go through now. We're going to go over structure of online things, design, content, interactivity, and social and third-party platforms. We're going to cover all of that. So when we talk about a structure, the structure of your site or your online information, we're talking about basically the content management system is the first place to look at. Some content management systems are actually really poor at accessibility, and they just don't even support some of the things you may want to do to ensure really good accessibility. Now, if you're all on WordPress, don't worry about it because WordPress is really phenomenal, and most of them are okay. But that's the first thing to consider is you don't want to be hindered by your content management system. It just may not have, what you need to ensure accessibility. And then keep in mind too, the third-party platforms that may come with that. And then there's sort of some global website-wide attributes that are part of the structure. So that's defining what's called the viewport, which is how much space the information should take on a screen, defining the language, defining the major sections. What is a navigation section? What is a content section? What is a header section, a footer section? There's all this coding now that defines sections in your site. And these accessibility tools really leverage that because as a person goes through your website page after page, they don't necessarily want their tool to read out the navigation every time. They may want to just load a new page and start with the content, right? Because they already have an idea what your links are. So those are these global structural things. So, and the navigation is really important. The navigation and how you can navigate through your site, use links, use forms, use buttons, calls to action. There's best practices for all of that. And that's very important. That's kind of what we think about as the overarching structure. So now on something like a social media platform, you can't really control that, right? You're really just putting content up there. And third-party tools, if you have a donation platform, something else, you also might not be able to control a lot of that. But on your own website, you can control the structure. That's just an example. This is an Animal Humane website, and one of the tools we use that's very handy, a couple tools. One of the first picture is Andy, which is an accessibility tool actually created and put out by the government itself, US government. And the other one is Wave, and Wave is the primary tool I use. And both of these tools, I'm just looking at the structure. And on the right-hand side, I've turned off all design elements so I can visually see how the structure and the hierarchy of the site is, right? The hierarchy of your code is actually really important because much like a search engine crawling bot or something, which doesn't see your website, it just ingests all of the code and interprets it. That's the same way how accessibility tools work. So making use of best practices for your coding and best practices in your navigation, your site hierarchy is incredibly important. The next major area is really design. Okay, and that's having enough color and contrast to meet minimum standards. There's a minimum sort of standard for what contrast has to happen for people to understand text and different things. Minimum sizes for text too. Also font choices and how fonts are aligned. And there's a lot of cognitive differences that fall into the realm of accessibility. And some people have a very hard time, for instance, with centered text. A big block of centered text, their mind has a really hard time processing that. So it's general best practice to left align all your text. Using fonts where the letters connect, maybe a cursive or a script or something where letters are connecting, causes issues a lot of times for people with different cognitive abilities. And then buttons and icons and different design cues. And I'll talk about this more. Some things are exempt. For instance, your logo or any design element, which is sort of just extra that isn't critical to the understanding of your content or function of your site, is technically exempt from accessibility. I would say make it accessible anyways, right? It's all about inclusion. I don't want to have two dramatically different experiences for my website for different people. I want everyone to enjoy, understand, and consume all of our, the content in the same way, if possible. And this is an area nonprofits struggle with the most. The most is with design. And we find this typically because, nonprofits typically have fairly soft color palettes. They're not super high contrasty, sort of the official brand colors, maybe quite light, which can cause some issues. So In designing for accessibility, we see ourselves a lot of times using brand colors as accents, maybe not necessarily the major colors used. Just another example from Wave. Here's a site, a major nonprofit, and just running a test on one of their pages, there was 37 contrast errors. So that is this tool saying this piece of text or doesn't match what the minimum requirements are. So, and kind of the work that we typically do. So we have sort of a standard accessibility audit product you can buy from us, which is basically consulting. It's a consulting product, and our report always includes this list of your brand colors, and we test them. So you can see this is a picture, just one page from one of our reports. And we go through all of the brand colors they have in their brand guide, and they basically all fail. All fail the contrast test, except for the very dark blue one. So that's something we always look at. You should consider that too. Actually, our own brand guide has accessibility baked into the brand guide and talks specifically about where you can use different color combinations and how those work. So I'm going to switch this poll here. Thank you for answering. So the next poll here is kind of about funding. So that's design. Now let's talk about content. What is accessible content really? So content, we're talking about not just text and pictures and things, but buttons, links, and any sort of calls to action. These things need descriptions. So a perfect example is, a lot of times you see on a website a link that says click here. And if you are consuming the website on a normal computer, mouse, keyboard, and you're scrolling through, you may be able to understand that because of the content around it. But a very typical way someone with a disability will use a website is they will, in their accessibility tool, hit a thing that just says, read me all the links in this page, read all the links, so I can know where I want to go next. Well, if you hear a link read out and it says click here, that's pretty useless. Learn more, click here, what all these sorts of like link text, which you see pretty common, that's poor accessibility standards, because if you just hear that, you won't know what that means. So that's an example. And of course, alt text for images. Anything that's visual, a video, an image, anything like that, it needs to be described and supported with text as well. So that's the alt text, the special coding that goes in your image. And then closed captioning for multimedia, of course, for video. Also PDFs. In general, you really should avoid any external file types. And if you do absolutely have to have an external file type on your website, say you have a link to download your annual report or what have you, there are actual ways to make PDFs accessible. So if you have to have a third party sort of file on your site that's not a web page, the PDFs are the most recommended. And the Adobe Acrobat tool itself has a accessibility checker in it. So before you publish any PDFs, make sure whoever's designing them or creating them does check them and run that tool for accessibility. In general, though, avoid external files, because what will happen is, on a iPhone or a special device for accessibility, that's going to hit that file download and it may or may not work. It may have to open another application. It's just kind of complicated. So it looks like the vast majority are not sure if any of your funding it has accessibility requirements. So definitely check into that. It is becoming a very common thing. And for sure, hands down, if you get any money from the federal government, state government, local government, that probably in the fine print has something that says something about accessibility. So here's an example of that. So that alt text I was talking about, that alt text. So here's a picture from a major nonprofit, and you can see they do a pretty good job. The little green text under that photo of the dog and the woman says, "Woman on couch with dog and coffee." Pretty good. Now you'll notice, here's a tip. You'll notice that alt text does not start with image of or photo of, because what actually happens with many accessibility tools, if someone uses the function to say, hey, tell me about the graphics on this page, those tools will say an image of or a photo of. So you don't need to put that in your alt text. Otherwise, the device will read out, a photo of woman on a couch, blah, blah, blah. It's just redundant. So you don't need to include that in your alt text. And we have a guide on writing alt text, and that's actually going to be included in the follow-up email. And then this is some closed captioning for a client of mine. And closed captioning is really easy to do. And of course, many major platforms, for instance, like YouTube, it will just do it automatically. And even if you have not touched it or turned that option on, Facebook, YouTube, they are doing automatic, even Instagram, they are doing automatic captions for things, pictures and video. Although they could be pretty poor, if your audio isn't great, those closed captions could be way off. So this is a picture of YouTube's tool, which is actually really phenomenal. What we recommend clients do is load up your YouTube videos, turn on automatic captions, go into the caption manager and just correct the mistakes. And so it takes very little time, actually, especially with professionally done video. The audio is very clear. So it's pretty easy to do. So don't skip that. Don't skip captioning things. Let's switch the poll again, actually, here real quick. I think I have one about audits. So functionality. Now, when we're talking about functionality, that's a major component of accessibility. And we see the most issues usually with forms. And forms are critical, like if a donate form, contact form, sign up for a program form, sign up for your email newsletter, what have you. Those forms and the buttons and the form controls in them, they need to be accessible. That means having field labels. And when you have fields that go together, like checkboxes, radio buttons, you need form field sets. And you also need to make sure you have what's called the focus. And this is actually a thing that I've seen even on some major websites where what's called focus is not done properly. And that has to do with going through a site without a mouse, having being able to use a keyboard and tab through elements. And so basically, that's a major tenet of sort of accessibility systems, is they basically send keyboard commands to your website. And I'll talk about that when we get into testing. An easy way to test functionality is to load up your website. Don't touch your mouse, just use your keyboard and see if you can use your site. So pop-ups, chat bots, other features that are sort of interactive, those can cause a ton of accessibility issues. So you need to test those, make sure that, your support chat or anything is accessible. And site search too. We see big issues with search. A lot of times their website's pretty good, but they never test the search. Can the search be used with just a keyboard? Are the results formatted in an accessible way? And then e-commerce, right? You want to be able to either sell things or collect donations or whatever. So really testing that interaction, the data input's importance. Pop-ups we see pop-ups and things that slide in cause a lot of issues, because the page changes and focus may be broken. So that's something to consider. Here's another picture. So this has two forms on it, and there's a search lost pet form. Now this is just a great demonstration too of how complex accessibility can be. So that form is okay. You see the little green tag, that's an indication of a form label. So that form has the correct label. The button has not the greatest text. It's a search. I don't know why it says apply. But you'll see there's a contrast error on that button. So the blue and the white, it's not enough contrast. Now, the other form on this page is actually a search form way up in the upper right-hand corner. That form has a big issue. The magnifying glass, which makes sense to someone with vision, search, right? Magnifying glass, you can click on it. That link to open their search has no description of it. There's no text description behind that. Someone using a screen reader would not even know likely that there is a search on this site. So that's a major oversight. And when it comes to interactivity too, you just really want to be wary of form builders or external tools or whatever external tool. Test those tools. People sometimes miss that. And then you want to avoid as much as possible things like iframes or including things in the site from an external source. That's difficult for accessibility tools to use and track the focus throughout the site when there's a lot of external things included. So those are things to really look at. So have you done an audit? It looks like about 25% of you have done an audit. And about 25% of you, it seems like you plan on it. So that's good. And by audits, I don't mean necessarily just buying a tool. I mean working with an actual consultant. I should have been more clear on that question. Now, when we get into a lot of interactivity, there's one other part of accessibility which you may or may not need, and it's called ARIA. So ARIA is only supported in the latest version of HTML or our later version. I think it's HTML5. So HTML is kind of the language that builds websites and displays them into your browser. And there's different versions. So they added something called ARIA, and ARIA is mostly for web applications. It's for complicated interactivity. It does add some special compatibility for certain devices. It's for advanced kind of interactive forms and systems. And in general, you can avoid this. Most of the time, most clients don't need ARIA. And you can learn more. There's going to be a link to learn more about ARIA if you want in the follow-up email. But you need to carefully consider whether you decide to use this ARIA technology or not, because like I said, it's only supported in the latest HTML. There are a lot of popular accessibility devices that rely on older versions of HTML. And so they may not get the form controls and understand ARIA. So that's something that's a little bit more of a technical thing, but it's something that's important to consider. Let's talk a little bit about social media, because really this webinar is online accessibility. That means everything: your third-party systems, your file downloads, your website, your social media, your YouTube, everything, right? So social media now, they lagged behind really having good accessibility, and they got in big trouble for it, right? Facebook and a lot of companies got in trouble for poor accessibility. So lately, in the last few years, they've made a lot of improvements. So my top advice for social media is, for sure, leverage all the features they allow you to use. If any accessibility feature they have, whether it's closed caption or adding alt text, leverage all those features. And a lot of people don't realize this, but you can add alt text to your Instagram posts. You can add alt text to your Facebook posts. You can add alt text in a lot of areas that people maybe don't think about. And if you don't do it yourself, these social media platforms now are going to just guess what your picture is and put in text. And the text maybe not. So this is a little picture just of my own Instagram, right? And I put a picture of my cat up there. It's a bit hard to read, but it's my personal Instagram, so I'm not really investing in accessibility. It's just personal. But what Instagram put for the alt text for that picture is a picture by Nicholas Longton may be a picture of a cat. So it actually can tell it's a picture of a cat, but that's not super useful. If I really wanted to make this picture accessible, I would manually put in the alt text and describe the cat stuff. So there's going to be a guide on social media accessibility coming in this email as well, so you can learn more about that. Also, when you're talking about campaigns, just in general, you're going to launch a social media capital campaign to raise money to build a building or this or that, or give to the max, or you're doing some kind of social campaign. I've seen a lot of whole campaigns where they just are not accessible. Like the whole campaign is these short video clips of something happening, and there's no closed captioning, or there's no extra text. There's nothing to support that media. So when you're actually planning a campaign from the get-go, bake in accessibility into your social media campaigns. So let's talk now. We're getting close to the end of this. We'll have a lot of time for questions. And of course, feel free to ask questions the whole time. But we're going to get into kind of how do you evaluate your accessibility and how do you maintain it? Let's switch this poll here quick too as well. So evaluating and maintaining your accessibility. So we talked about the major buckets. A big thing for checking your accessibility is getting some type of audit. And I want to talk a little bit about audits. That means a lot of different things to different people. And when I kind of talk about accessibility audit, I'm talking about, kind of working with real people, like an actual expert, to help you look at everything. And that's very important for a lot of reasons. There's really no quick fixes for accessibility. There is not a magic bullet or a tool or an overlay or like a plugin for WordPress. There really is no tool that just automatically kind of fixes everything, right? And we've also noticed AI in sort of automatic auditing tools, they don't do very well. They miss a lot of things. They also have a lot of false positives. And I'll show you some of those, how that works. And also, they just don't understand and can't sort of prioritize for you. So every organization has different goals, a different audience you serve, and different things going on, right? And different priorities. And so you could get 100 accessibility errors on one page, which might sound horrible, but not understanding the effort to fix them, which AI doesn't understand, not understanding the priority, what are the most, urgent ones that are actually breaking the site for people. None of these automatic tools can understand that. Unfortunately, it does take an expert. You have to work with an expert. And talking a little bit further about this, because I really want to help you all stay out of trouble, right, and not get into the legal part of this and get into trouble. There's been a lot of news lately. You could Google this and go check it out. But tons of news of lately about new case law and organizations actually getting into trouble for using accessibility tools. It seems counterintuitive, right? But there's a lot of accessibility overlays or scanning tools or plugins that, promise to kind of fix everything. And I just want to say they don't. They absolutely don't. I have evaluated probably 25 accessibility tools and systems out there. I have never found one that is 100% accurate. And now there's case law building up that is actually really kind of against these tools. One of the most popular ones is called Accessibee. You've probably seen ads for it. I mean, Accessibee advertises like crazy. I see their ads all over the place. A big online retailer actually got into a huge amount of trouble for using Accessibee. And the lawsuit said, well, that you're not trying, you're just slapping this tool on, you're not actually addressing accessibility. You're kind of trying to do a quick fix, and that's not good enough. And the Accessibee tool itself breaks a lot of accessible devices and software. It just doesn't work. A lot of those tools too tend to really slow your website down. So if you want to learn more about the legal stuff happening in the news, you can Google it. But it's just it's unfortunate, but there really is no magic bullet for this. As we've talked about this, I'm sure you've kind of gotten the hint that it's kind of complicated. Accessibility is complicated. So I asked this question about your brand guide. It says none of you said 0% has said your brand guide addresses accessibility. So that is something to consider. Typically, it's a one page in your brand guide that kind of talks to the designer, right? That says colors, fonts. It kind of lays out, what to avoid with your official brand colors. That's a typical page now we're seeing in brand guides. So switch the poll again here. Thank you so much for answering these. This gives me a lot of insight on what I can help you with. So the first major tool you can use to kind of look at your accessibility of your actual website or your social media or whatever is just your browser. There are tools built into your browser. So most of you probably use Chrome or Firefox, and they both have a similar tool. There's a tool built in called Lighthouse. And Lighthouse will test for SEO, for mobile compatibility, and it will test for accessibility too. And it'll give you a score. And then I'm going to actually show you a tool called Wave. So the two major browser plugins I would recommend is Wave and Andy. These are both completely free. Wave is made by a nonprofit, and Andy is made by the federal government. And then, of course, like I said, your mobile phones have an accessibility mode built in. You could always turn that on. And you could always try to use your website strictly with your keyboard, using only the tab, arrow, enter key, spacebar, those types of keys. That's what accessibility devices are actually doing. They're sending key commands to, your website to the browser. So those are some things you can look at. And mobile phones are, like I said, are extremely popular in the sort of deaf and blind community, the disabled community, because they've always kind of had these features baked in. It's very popular. So have you tried? So I asked the question, have you tried to use your website with only a keyboard? Half of you have said yes. So that's really cool. It's actually rare. I hear people have tried that. So that's great. So here's a screenshot. You can see here just from Lighthouse, the accessibility score. This page said 83. Now, here's the thing, like I talked about working with an expert, that score is kind of misleading. It's, I guess, good to see a number, right? A number from 0 to 100. So you can go from page to page and, oh, okay, the home page was 80, but the contact page was 20. It does give you a relative idea, but the number, it doesn't talk really about the priority of these issues, right? And that's a big thing, because likely you're going to have a lot of accessibility issues. Some will be 2 seconds to fix, and some will be more complicated, some will be more impactful, and some less impactful. So these tools are helpful, the tools I'm going to show you, but they really are mostly reserved for experts because you have to interpret and know what these things mean. But they're still useful. This is the Andy tool. So this is looking at the structure of this site. This is, as you can see in the dropdown, Andy has kind of tabs representing kind of what I talked about, structure, design, content, and stuff. So the structure tab shows you the heading breakdown. And it has a lot of useful tools, this tool. It's basically just a bookmark you add to your browser, and then you can access that on any page you're on the internet. You can turn that on. And the structure is very important, like I said before, because that is how devices who can't, see your website determine where sections of your site are, what may be more important or less important. The major tool we use is Wave. So Wave is by this nonprofit called WebAIM, and AIM stands for Accessibility in Mind. So this is my go-to tool, and actually a lot of very, very expensive commercial tools that could cost you thousands of dollars a month. You can get sort of an automated scanning tool that is based on Wave that uses their technology. But if your website's more than a few hundred pages, if your website has a lot of pages, those tools get extremely expensive. You could be paying thousands of dollars every month for the tool. So the thing I really like about Wave is connected to this phenomenal organization that gives you a lot of information about accessibility. They're kind of the gold standard. So this tool will show you what's broken, what's wrong, and built into it, it has a button to click that explains what this means. So say it shows an error that says empty heading, and well, I don't know, what does empty heading mean? I don't even know what that means. And if you have an empty heading on your page, you actually can't see it because it's empty. So as a human, you can't even see it. So there's a little button you'll click and will explain exactly what empty heading means and why that's bad. So this is a phenomenal tool, and they also have training on their site and all kinds of information. So check out that, and I'll demo it for you right now. There's also the W3C. This is the kind of the global web standards body, right? The W3C has a whole directory of tools, which is really cool. And of course, Wave is in that directory. They have a directory of tools you can look at if you want. They have a directory of resources. The really valuable thing I find about W3C is they have their resources broken down by role. If you're a designer, programmer, blogger, content person, whatever role you're responsible at your organization, they break down things that are important for your role, which is really cool. It's actually very valuable. So I'm gonna switch this poll again. Looks like most of you said no. A little over half have said no, you haven't tried your site with the keyboard. It's an enlightening experience. I would try it. Feel free, of course, to ask questions if you have any questions about any of this. So here's a question about, or a poll about third-party platforms. That's the thing, you need to test your third-party platforms, and people get a little confused on how this works, but basically, technically under accessibility guidelines, every single link on your website that leaves your website, goes somewhere else, you are supposed to make sure that destination is also accessible, which could be, basically almost impossible, right? If you have a blog article, you're talking about something, you want to link to another resource or something out there, having to make sure everything you link to is accessible it's almost impossible. However, your event registration system, your donation systems, say you have a form tool you link to apply for a job or like whatever, those are major like functional areas of your online system and ecosystem. You need to check those need to be accessible, and unfortunately many times they are not. And there may be things you can do about that or not. Actually, a kind of interesting example, I just completed a big accessibility audit for a state agency for the government, and they have a very large section on their website about accessibility, and their form to submit a complaint about accessibility is not accessible. So I unfortunately had to call that out to them to say, this form platform you're using to collect data, it's not accessible. So you need to change that. So getting help, where to go from now? Let's say you don't know if you have an accessibility issue, or you know you have some issues. What do you do? Like I've said, I highly recommend you work with some kind of consultant. Work with a out of the box accessibility tools, and you can Google it and read the news. They just don't work. This is a very complicated thing with a lot of subtleties. And so, that there's AI tools out there, they're getting better. But I always like to say, when I talk to people, I say, well, our intelligence isn't artificial, right? We're humans, and we're actually looking and working in partnership with clients to figure out, what's the priority, what can they do, what can they do with their budget and stuff, and how should they sort of craft a strategy for accessibility. Because keep in mind, every time you change your website, things are going to change, right? And your accessibility is a moving target. It's not a standstill thing. So, thank you for the question. Great question. Do you have recommended vendors for tools? We do have some recommended vendors. We have some recommended plugins as well. For instance, the Gravity Forms plugin for WordPress can be made pretty much 100% accessible. But unfortunately, a lot of the major tools like Salesforce or HubSpot or CRMs, which have form builders, those are not. So unfortunately, it's tricky. So what we do usually when we're building a new website or doing like a redesign, and a client has these requirements, we need this tool, that tool, we need a calendar, events, registration, we will actually look at those tools and test them. So as far as blogs, surveys, really WordPress and Gravity Forms, that combination is super common to cover almost all of people's requirements. And it works phenomenal. So, I mean, like, let's say you use Constant Contact and their built-in form isn't accessible. You can still use Gravity Forms and have your newsletter sign up or something, just go from Gravity Forms into Constant Contact. So that's a way, and I don't know if they are accessible or not. That one I can't remember last time I looked at Constant Contact, but that's an example of where that platform might not be accessible, but where your users interact with it, you can make accessible by just using your own form. So like I've said, it's kind of complicated, ever evolving thing. So I can do a review now. I can open this up for Q&A. We have 10 minutes. I can do a live review of your website if you want to just take a quick peek. If anyone puts their website or a website of another nonprofit or any website you want, if you want to put one in the chat and you're just kind of like, I wonder if that's accessible or not, I can show you a bit of the process that we go through as accessibility consultants to evaluate sites. I can show you kind of how some of those subtleties are, where something, oh, there's all these errors, but it may be like a 2-second fix. Okay, so we have one in here. Let's check it out. Thank you so much. I'm going to switch this poll to here. I have just a couple more polls. Okay, Georgia Aquarium. Aquarium, cool. One of my very first website projects in the 90s was for the Shed Aquarium in Chicago. I don't know if anyone's familiar with the Shed Aquarium. Huge aquarium. I did a campaign for them, email campaign. Okay, cool. So we have a pop-up right away. Whoa, that's moving around. All right. So right off the bat, I can tell you this text isn't going to pass. This gray on white, that's going to be, even if you had a poor monitor, that would be very hard to read. So I'm just going to right click on this site and go Wave this page. So let's pull up Wave. So Wave has, this is just the sort of summary. 42 errors, 49 contrast errors, and alerts. Now alerts, you may or may not have to do something about those. Okay, and then features, this is just showing accessibility features present, the structural elements, and ARIA. So if you look at the details, okay, this is actually kind of common. We have this missing form label. So, and sometimes it's hard to see with the design present what these things do. So you can always do this, turn off styles. So the form label here is the search. The search is missing a form label. And like I said, this has some tools in here to see things. You can click this reference tool, and right here, it tells you exactly what that means. So that's pretty cool. So you have a missing form label. That's kind of a big thing. You have an empty button. So that's a button that someone won't know what that means if they don't have, with the screen reader. You could ignore the no script stuff. That's not usually hugely impactful. Again, empty links. So links that don't contain text is an issue. So it's mostly empty links and form labels. which could be very easy to fix. I don't know because I haven't seen the code, but it could be very easy to fix. Now, I want to talk about contrast errors because this is something where there's subtlety involved with contrast errors. Okay, so some contrast errors are obvious, like the yellow on white, light gray on white here, contrast. Now, you are always going to see some kind of contrast error when you have text over a picture. The reason is these tools don't look at every pixel of a picture. They just can't do that. So every time there's text over a picture, it's going to be flagged as a contrast error. So that's where kind of human intelligence comes in. You have to actually look at that and see, is that contrasty enough or not? It's a lot of contrast error. So here we get into alerts. Alerts may or may not be an issue. So redundant alternative text, that can be an issue. And you can see here is some linked image. So this might be from Instagram or something that kind of looks like that. So you'll see this text in here. You can see the text. And if there's, I don't know if that's really useful. So I would look at the alternative text. Orphan form label, that's a form label that's present, but it's not attached to a field. Lots of redundant links. And so I want to talk quick about redundant links. That's something that comes up constantly. So it's very common, say you have a page that lists out your blog articles. It's very common to have a picture, and that picture is a link, have a headline, the headline's a link. And at the end of the little description, maybe you have the first couple lines, you'll have a read more, that's a link. So you have 3 links, all very close to each other. They all go to the same place. That's no big deal for maybe someone using a mouse and keyboard, but like I kind of described earlier, there's a feature people say, they click a button and it says, read all the links to me. Well, now they're going to hear 3 links that are exactly the same. And so it's not necessarily an error, but that is highly annoying. If you have a blog page with 10 articles, now you're going to have 30 links that only go to 10 places. It's kind of, it's an annoyance. So we looked at this. Let's take a look at another one, givemn.org, and feel free as we're doing this, put in questions if you have them in the Q&A. We'll check out this website. Again, I immediately know this text, you're going to get a contrast error. Wave this page. Yep, 42 contrast. Like I said, design, it's very common for most of the errors to be design. So there's some missing alt text. A couple of pictures don't have right here. This picture, it says, there's no alt text. And, pictures and icons, like I said, part of a design, which aren't critical to the understanding or function, are exempt. So another thing where artificial intelligence doesn't cut it. It doesn't know what's important or not. Empty links, a broken ARIA reference. I have actually never seen that. That's not very common. I haven't seen that one. I would look into that. A lot of low contrast errors. So here, low contrast here. This white and green, that does not meet the minimum. Minimum standards is 3:1 for design elements and 4.5:1 for text. And the size of the text and what's around it actually determine what that minimum requirement is. So it's actually variable. It goes all over the place. Again, there's a picture here. So every one of these is going to get flagged. Even if the contrast is fine, it will be flagged for it. So I'm trying to look for, so here's how I talk about justified text. Cognitive issues sometimes have people have a really hard time understanding if text is not left aligned. So again, redundant links. So let's look at another one. I want to try to get one with headings maybe, or something different where there's some kind of different weird error that's not common. So we'll look at this one. Okay, this is actually looks like a .info. Wave this page. So again, a lot of empty links here. These will need to be described with some kind of text so someone knows what that link actually does. Again, low contrast. This gray for sure. That is gray on white is, there was a period years ago where that was very popular to kind of have all these subtle tones of gray. It's way too too low of a contrast ratio. Tab index issue. So that's an issue, potential issue with that, tabbing, right? Like tabbing through your site with just a keyboard to see if you can get it to work. Let's see, do I have any more in here? That looks like all the ones that people volunteered for. So yeah, that's kind of just a little preview of kind of what we do as consultants, of how we go through sites. And we really kind of, basically, we provide you with this training, and an actual audit. We tell you, what's broken on all your pages, but really it's the consulting and how to fix these. So things like this text, you've got, all these, you may have like hundreds and hundreds of contrast errors. This can usually be all fixed at once. It can be fixed at once in your website's programming in the style sheet. And so it actually seems daunting, very quick to fix usually. Another thing I'm going to talk just quick, since we have a few more minutes, I'll switch the poll. It says 100% of you said that you do not have an accessibility guide. So one thing that our audits include, kind of our standard product, is a guide. It includes a cheat sheet for your staff. And they can just have it at their desk, whether you're a designer, a blogger, if you're doing outreach, you're managing donations, whatever. We give you this cheat sheet tailored to your organization, your site. Keep in mind these things. So it's really cool. It's a nice checklist. So as you go and work on your site, add content, you don't continually make, new problems, right? New accessibility problems. So just one final poll, if you want to answer that. But about links, I want to talk about that quick, because people constantly ask me, they say, what is the best link color? What color should our links be? And it does not matter, as long as the color meets contrast minimums, right? The most important thing about links when it comes to accessibility is that they are all the same color. So and that can be tricky sometimes in how you design and the strategy of building your site. But when every single link is the same color, that is easy for people to understand, especially people with some kind of disability. So that's super important. It doesn't necessarily need to be blue or red or green or whatever. Just if all the links are the same color and that color meets that minimum requirement, that's what I would say for links. So thank you so much for joining me. Keep in mind, follow-up email. It comes on Tuesday. Links to everything I covered will be in there, all the tools, all the information. A link to rewatch this, no registration. You can send it to friends, other staff members, whatever. Watch it as many times as you want. And information about upcoming free webinars. So you're very welcome. I mean, a lot of thank yous in the chat. You're very welcome. I really hope this was helpful. Feel free to email me too. Email me, reach out if you want to know more about, like, specifically what ArcStone offers, our different audits and reports. We've been doing this for a while now. We kind of were ahead of the curve a little bit on this. And so it's very fun and satisfying to really help people make sure that they're just inclusive. They're on your online information, your websites, your systems, as inclusive as possible, right? That's kind of what we're really trying to champion, is kind of, the web for everyone, right? So, and also benefits your SEO, so you get other benefits. So it looks like this final poll, 86% said you don't have a go-to accessibility tool or service. That's pretty common. It's actually pretty common. And unfortunately, the better services are just ridiculously expensive. So, well, thank you so much for the polls and for coming. I really appreciate your time. I know everyone's getting burnt out on webinars and everything. So look for that follow-up email, and I hope you all have a fantastic day. Thank you very much.